I've been doing watercolor for about almost 4 years now, and there's several things that I've learned that I think would help a beginner. So I went ahead and made a watercolor cheat sheet, which you should be able to download from the main page. But I'm going to go through a couple of basic things. When most people think of painting, they usually think of oil or acrylic painting. That's what most people typically have in mind. Watercolor is a bit different. So when you start with it, you have to learn some new things. First of all, for example, there are very different textures. Oil or acrylics tend to stay on the surface of the paper. They're very thick, and they literally will sit on top of the paper. And you can actually I'll try and make it a little bit thicker. But you can see it actually sits on top of the paper. Watercolor, on the other hand, tends to sink into the paper. For example, the paper will start sucking up the paint. And you can see it lays very, very flat on it. There's absolutely no texture to it. Especially if you have a good quality paper that's made of cotton, like for example Arches, it will literally suck some of the paint, and some of the paint will absorb into the paper itself. Second of all, acrylic tends to stay where you put it. Because it is thick, it stays in place. Watercolor, on the other hand, if you're painting with a lot of water, if you tilt your paper, the water will start and the paint will start to follow the trail of the water, basically. So water will move around, which can make it challenging to control. Third issue, oil and acrylic paints are both opaque. You don't see anything underneath it. For example, a pencil line. You can see there's a pencil line. No sign of the pencil line is left. Watercolor, on the other hand, if you make a pencil line here, which you can see, it will show through. You can sometimes do much darker pigment and it will show through less, but you can still see underneath it. What that means is that some of your mistakes are going to be visible. You can't always cover them up. With acrylic or oil, you lighten paint by adding white to it. As such. With watercolor, you lighten your paint by adding more water. For example, that would be the darker version. If you wanted a lighter version, you would add a whole lot more water. Create it out to the finest thing. In contrast, if you want darker colors with acrylic and oil, you would add black. And that would darken some of your colors. There are other ways to do it as well, but that's one of the common ways. With watercolor, you have several options. You can use thicker paint, like I said before. Just use less water and more paint on your brush to create darker colors. You can also mix a complementary color. For example, add a little green to a red because they're opposite colors. That one didn't really work very well, but basically you can either use a more concentrated version of that. You can use a darker pigment, for example, a darker red. Which is a different colored paint that would add darkness to it. Or you can use complementary colors. For example, a dark green should deepen or darken a red. So those are your options for that. Acrylic and oil tend to dry pretty close to the original color. Watercolor, on the other hand, often dries lighter or slightly duller. For example, this color right here is the dried version of that color. You can see that it dries much lighter. Let me show you another example. In acrylic painting, you can use paint right next to each other. Because it is thick and viscous, the colors don't blend unless you make them blend. So you can put two colors right next to each other. With watercolor, on the other hand, if you put two colors next to each other, because they're both water, the water bleeds together. So you can see. What that means is it's very important to let your watercolor dry. If you want to mix colors, that's an excellent way to have very cool effects happen. But if you don't want to mix your colors and you want to keep a straight division between things, you need to let the first area dry before you move into the second area. And finally, oil and acrylic paints tend to have staying power. They tend to have the same quality throughout all different colors and all different brands. Watercolor paint, on the other hand, have some colors that are staining and other colors that are not. For example, this is a Quin Coral, and if I add more water to it, what you can see is no matter how much water I add or how much scrubbing I do, there's still a little trace of it on the paper. Other colors, for example, yellow, if you add water, you can basically make it go away. That's a staining color. It has a pigment that once it settles in, it's not going to leave your paper earlier. And the other one has a non-staining color, meaning you can easily remove it. Anyway, those are the first lessons. I hope that they were helpful. Thank you.